Good afternoon and welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangout. This is a weekly event presented by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. Today we have with us Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107, and I'm Ben Peruzzi from Barrel Strength Design. Today we're going to be looking at Straight Up Craft and doing a performance review. Andrew's going to run us through a series of tests looking at how the site's doing, what it looks like on mobile and desktop, how fast it's happening. We'll get into a lot of different metrics and try to show everyone how you could be reviewing your own websites and what we can learn from Straight Up Craft, which I will be the first to admit has plenty of room for opportunity. So
well, you said you started it when Craft wasn't even 1.0, right?
Yeah, so Straight Up Craft started at 0.2193 of Craft. It's before Matrix, before live preview. When we it actually started as a single page that wasn't even in Craft. It was I put up Craft and then I just used Twig, the Twig templating to put up a static page of resources that I had been collecting, and from there its initial goal, and one we hope to get back to this year, it was more towards craft education and training and teaching about craft. And as the community evolved, as craft evolved, there's just a lot of opportunities of kind of creating a community site for things like where the plugins were aggregated and a gallery for projects and stuff. And so the site deviated from its original goal of being just a learning site, and we're in the process of bringing more components of learning back into it as Pixel and Tonic kind of grows its role in providing service, like the case studies and other things that people are looking for in the craft community. So yeah, the users, when we went live with the users section, it was there was two different methods you needed to use to update. You needed one to update profile data and another to update the custom fields. You weren't even able to delete things from the front end of the site. That function wasn't secure. So we had a little note that said, if you need to delete your job post or your project, send us an email and we'll delete it for you. And so it's a site that's evolved a long time now. We're on the latest version of Craft, and due to that, the code base has kind of been through its course. It's been hard to keep up with updating to the latest, most optimized features. And as anybody who builds websites knows, as you grow a complex website, a lot of things come up that you didn't plan for and don't necessarily have time to solve in the best way possible. So. Andrew, I'm looking forward to this code review because I think I'm going to learn a lot from somebody looking at it.
Well, I think we're probably not going to do a ton of code review. I mean, really what I'm going to do is, and this is something that I do quite often. In fact, I just kind of finished doing something like this this week. But basically, we're going to take a look at a number of profiling tools and see what we can learn about the website. Because a lot of times I have clients call me in, they say, we want to optimize our website. How can we do that? And it is a multi-layered problem because there are a lot of things involved in it. And the first thing that I do is run a bunch of tools to kind of profile the site to see where we're at on it. And you can learn a great deal about the way a site is structured and what could possibly be better. Without ever even looking at the code. And I think it will be useful, hopefully, for a lot of people to see the various tools that we use to look at a website and see how it's performing. And then also talk about what those things mean and how do we actually end up fixing it. We decided it was a bad idea to do live server optimization while it was up and running. But we'll at least talk about what needs to be done to do it, which I think will probably be pretty helpful to some people. So here is our nice Straight Up Craft webpage right here. And why don't we just jump right into... Oh, look who it is.
Hey, man. Yeah, we're looking at your face right now.
Yes, Patrick from Mildly Geeky has joined us.
All right, you're right. It probably would be more interesting if we were actually looking at my screen.
It's debatable.
Yeah, well, you're either not very observant or very forgiving. It's one or the other. All right, so here is the wonderful Straight Up Craft homepage, and I think what we'll do is just take a look at briefly at some of the tools that we use to look at the page and see what that can kind of tell us about what the performance characteristics are and what we might look at doing when we're optimizing stuff. I will tell you that, Ben, I totally agree with you. When I approach doing these things, I would much rather be building a new performance site from scratch, because sometimes going back in is kind of like doing surgery to try and fix the way that a website was built in the first place. You know what I mean? And it can be.
We inherit we do website audits and performance reviews as well, and we inherit a lot of migrated sites, and it's interesting how frequently we have to just take out the layout structure and rebuild the layout to get things kind of set up in a way that can be optimized if you build the wrong way from scratch.
Right. And this is why I keep hammering on the Craft Podcast and to anyone else who will listen that really building performance sites is really about your workflow and your tool chain, because it's not so much. It's really about the way that the site was built that is going to determine the performance characteristics. I mean, obviously there are server-side optimizations and that kind of thing, but it's really an approach. So going in and fixing an existing site can seem somewhat daunting, and you do have to be surgical about it too, right? You want to fix the site, but you don't want to break it in the process. And I've done a number of these, and it can be kind of interesting. But let's jump right in and take a look at some of the performance characteristics of the site that we have here. So this is one of the.
We'll start with an F. All right.
Don't feel too bad. This is a page called Web Page Test, which is funny because it's Ben and I were talking about earlier. It's one of the ugliest sites out there, but it actually gives you some really, really useful information. Up here is kind of just a report card, but the real interesting stuff starts down here. So if we look under load time. It's telling us it's taking nearly 5 seconds to load the page. And obviously that's not good, right? We want it to be quicker than that. It's also telling us that it's taking us almost 2 seconds to get the first byte back from the server. And that is kind of a killer because, nothing can happen until data starts coming back from the server. And, some other speed index, I mean, I just don't really care about. Doesn't really make any difference to me. And then under here where we've got these stats for first view, and then we've got repeat view. So what this tool essentially does is it loads it in a browser, and you can actually pick what browser and what location that you want it loaded in. And it will load it once and record everything, and then it will do effectively a reload. And the reload, the repeat view, always should be a little bit faster, right? Because a number of the assets that we use are cached and all that kind of stuff. But we're seeing here that the time to get the first byte of data back from the refresh is still very slow, right? So that right there is telling me that the VPS that you're running this on and potentially the templates that are being used to render the page are probably going to be in need of some optimization. Now, what version of PHP are you running on this server, Ben?
I don't know the specific. I think it's not 7.
Not 7. That would be that would be what I would expect, is that it is not 7.
Yeah.
Because I would expect, even if the templates were marvelously inefficient, I would still expect to see a better first byte time if we were running PHP 7. So if you were a client, one of the first things I would say is let's move this to PHP 7. And Yeah, I did do. It looks like you're running Nginx, which is great.
I can confirm we're actually on Apache, so I'm not sure
Really?
what you're getting.
Because I ran this, and it seems to think that you're running on Nginx.
We're tricking folks. Good.
Are you doing
Yeah.
server pilot or anything like that, or
I don't know.
they kind of pair the two of them together?
Yeah, no, we have a cPanel server, or it's on cPanel right now. So yeah, I can attest to. So I think the interesting thing about first byte time worth noting, I think if you're a designer or front-end developer and you're trying to optimize a web page, look at this number first, because changing code or optimizing your images or whatever you're doing isn't going to help affect this number at all.
Right.
This is time to talk to your server guy, your IT guy, your hosting company, whoever it is, because this is out of your hands from the code perspective.
Yeah. And Andrew, I think the reason we're seeing Nginx, it looks like Cloudflare is in the middle.
That makes sense.
I think that's why.
That makes sense. Yeah, so you're using Cloud, and we'll get into the whole CDN thing later. But yeah, that's why it's being fooled into thinking that you're running Nginx, because it's your CDN is a proxy and it's using Nginx.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to call out with web page tests, I usually like to run like anywhere from 5 to 9, which is the most they allow of tests. Only because once in a while, you might just happen to have a little burst of traffic or something, or your servers, kind of muddle up. And I'd like to be able to see, have a better sample size to work with when trying to gauge the load time.
100%.
I just ran it 6 times, and the numbers are pretty close in line with what you have.
Yeah, 100% for all of these tests, actually. I like to run them multiple times because there is some variance, but you will, the more tests that you run, the closer you're going to regress to the mean in terms of what it really is.
So how important is, most of the time when we run these tests, we run them on the home page or the base URL. Mm-hmm. What do you think about, we have lots of pages on the site. We have different sections on the site. How much should we be trying to look at different pages versus the first?
Well, I look at, when I run these tests, I will run them first on the home page to just get an idea of the overall picture, right? Because, for instance, our time to first byte is going to be lousy on every page, right? Because it's a server-side thing. But I absolutely do run these tests on every major page on a site when I'm looking at performance optimizing it. Because there are, again, when you're doing a performance review, there are many, many facets to it. Some of them are global, such as the server performance, and others may be unique to a particular page. So I do run it on every single major page on the site. Now, if you have 1,000 blog posts, I'm only going to run it on one, right? Because it doesn't make any difference. They're all going to be the same kind of performance-wise.
If your blog has 1,000 matrix blocks and a bunch of relationships, you'll discover.
Exactly. But for the most part, like, the way that a site is put together is going to affect every page that's on there, and a surprising amount of this stuff is global. So, if you are doing primarily the tests on just your site homepage, which for every site I've ever seen, that's the highest traffic page anyway, you will be getting 90% of the way there in terms of understanding the performance characteristics of your web server. But definitely do still run it on subpages as well, just to make sure you don't have something like you're talking about in terms of one page that is using a matrix or whatever. But now that we've looked at the load time and the time to first byte, so just some numbers to shoot for. Ideally, I would like to see the time to first byte be roughly maybe a fourth to a fifth of what we're seeing here. In other words, 0.4 seconds or lower would be nice to see. And that's going to be especially important on mobile when we're talking about, we have the added latency of wireless networks and all that kind of fun stuff built in. But let's look at this from a visualization point of view. So, all right, so we saw this number and we saw this number in terms of how long did it take to load the whole page. Well, let's see what it actually looks like when the site is being loaded. So right here, this is the first request that goes out. That's going to your web server saying, give me the home page, right? And what you'll notice here is that nothing else is loading until this is done, because it doesn't know anything about the other resources that this page needs to load until the HTML page is returned to it, right? So as you can probably see from this graph, this is a big problem, because literally nothing happens until 2 seconds in, right? The time that it takes to get this web page from, to get the data from your server back to the browser is almost 2 seconds. And you can see it's like a traffic jam. Nothing else can be loading. So just looking at this, again, the first thing that I would do is I would say we're moving you to another VPS. And what I typically do for transitions like this is I set up a new VPS with PHP 7 and Nginx and MariaDB and all that kind of fun stuff. And I transition the site over using, we might use something like staging.straightupcraft.com or whatever. Make sure everything works, and then we switch the DNS over to use the new server setup. But that would literally be the first thing that I would do in attacking this, because as you can see, the overhead that is being added by the server is just something, no matter what you do otherwise, you're just blocked for 2 seconds, Yeah. So that would be the first thing that I would be doing here. Go ahead, Ben. Were you going to say something?
No, that sounds good, yes. And
yeah.
We do have plans to be migrating servers. So good to know. We're moving in the right direction. Yeah,
and for sure, like you're going to see just like that, a time to first byte improvement for sure. But let's look at just a couple of other things real quick that this is showing us here. So obviously we know our time to first byte is lousy, right? Keep alive enabled is just it's a server-side setting, which is basically keeping the connection open so that more data can be transmitted without creating and destroying a TCP connection. That goes away completely when you move to HTTP2, which if you're migrating your server, I would make that part of your migration.
I believe Cloudflare already serves over HTTP2.
It might be. It would make sense that it would be. But I guess what I'm saying is that once you are using HTTP2, Keep Alive is not even, it's deprecated because it's inherent in the protocol. But the thing that I'm just trying to stress here is that if we're already moving to a new VPS, use modern everything and use Nginx running HTTP2. And it is backwards compatible, so if someone's using an old browser, you don't have to worry about it. Everything's going to work. Compressed transfer just means that the data that is being transferred is being gzipped. So it's not just sending raw text or raw images, it's actually compressing it. Compress images, it says NA here. That's most likely because all the images on the pages are PNGs. And caching of static content, we will get into that a little bit later when we look at GT metrics. But I do want to show you something here. Now it says you have an effective use of a CDN, right? And for anyone that doesn't know, what a CDN is a content delivery network. And it gives you two real benefits. One is that your static assets, which is your JavaScript, your CSS, your images, whatever, they can be served from a server that is close to, in geographical location, the person that is browsing the website. And that's nice because it reduces the latency. Like if someone from Europe is browsing the site, the connection doesn't have to go all the way across the pond and then all the way back. For the large static resources that will be local to them. The other real nice benefit of using a CDN is it's what's called a cookieless domain, which cookies are those little pieces of data that get attached for storing various things, and they are attached to every single request from a domain, right? So let's say that you've got an image on Straight Up Craft and you're serving it directly from Straight Up Craft. All of your cookies are going to be attached to that image when it's sent over, and there's just no reason to have that be there. Using a CDN eliminates that. So, and CDNs are something that, a few years ago, it was just for large companies. These days, for as little as either free or $5 or $8 a month, you can be using a CDN. So it's definitely something that I think everyone should be looking into. But what I want to point, go ahead. Yeah.
Go on. And just to note, we do use Cloudflare's free plan on this site, which has that CDN.
Yep. Now, the one thing I wanted to point out here, though, is it says, okay, you're using CDNs effectively. That's great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? So we're actually using 8 different CDNs. This is somewhat of a problem from the point of view that it has to do a DNS lookup for every single one of these things, like the local computer or the local phone or whatever. Before it can load any of this stuff, it has to say, where is use.typekit.net? It has to look it up, get a result, and then load it. In an ideal world, you have one CDN so that there's one lookup.
So this is where you go through the resources on your page and make sure that you don't just copy and paste the Bootstrap CDN from the Bootstrap site. You go get that Bootstrap resource and you put it in your resources folder behind your own CDN location.
That would be how I would do it. Now, there is some benefit to using these CDNs in that, let's say someone was just visiting a site where they used this Bootstrap CDN. Well, they might already have it cached.
I'm not even sure where we have Bootstrap on the site.
Well,
it looks like foundation, yeah.
You got it somewhere.
Yeah.
But the basic idea is, okay, well, they may already have this stuff cached locally, which, I don't know. 6 dozen in one, half a dozen in another. I prefer to have everything running off of one CDN.
Yeah, we're going to touch on DNS prefetch.
Probably not. Go ahead.
Okay. If you do, and this is something where it's one of those like right before you go live type things, but if you know that your application is going to be pulling from Typekit and Google Analytics, and what else do we have? Kind of the usual suspects of maybe an ad tracking server. You can put, almost similar to linking to a style sheet, a link tag up at the top of your base HTML with rel equals, and if you just Google DNS prefetch, you can see it. But you can basically instruct the user agent to proactively do that DNS lookup ahead of time and get that out of the way, because eventually it is going to be needed. And that way you get to do all that concurrently very early on, and then later on when you do need to ping Typekit and ping googleapis.com, you've already done that DNS work up front and don't have to suffer that little, it's not long, but maybe like 30 milliseconds it can add up.
And that only really helps if you are then loading this stuff async later on, because if you do the prefetch and then the next thing that you do is reference that style sheet or whatever, you haven't saved anything. But I just kind of wanted to point that out, that's something to take a look at, is the number of things that we are actually doing in here. So while we're on web page test, let's take a look at this. This is another kind of cool feature of web page test. It's taking a screenshot at 0.5 second intervals, and you can change that, showing you what the browser looks like at each interval. And the fun thing to look at here is, imagine a person at the other end, and they're staring at this, right? 0.5 seconds, they're staring at white. 1 second, white. 1.5 seconds, white. 2 seconds, white. 2.5 seconds. I mean, you get the idea. It's not until 4 seconds that they actually see something, right? And it may not seem like a big deal, but nobody likes waiting. Nobody likes hitting the reload button on their browser and seeing nothing but white for 4 seconds before the page loads. And I think this is a really cool kind of visualization tool that web page test offers. You can actually see the way that it loads, and you can even look at a video of it loading. You can do a slow-mo video, but it's kind of cool. You can see at every spot, you can see where stuff finally gets loaded in here, and you can scrub and see as stuff is loaded. And when it turns gray like that, that means that it's ready for user interaction. But this is just a really cool tool to be able to visualize how your website is actually loading, and it can be pretty informative, I think, to be able to look at this kind of stuff. My video will be available shortly. All right, whatever. Let's go on to something else.
All right, that's web page test. We got some good insights out of that one.
Yeah, and it does, it does more than just what I showed you. But I think and all of these tests overlap, at least to some extent. And I think, go ahead.
Is it worth also noting that some of this stuff is available even in your Chrome developer tools now? And
yes.
I'm almost less familiar using it there than I am on these websites, but I think even I've seen timeline and screenshot views in web developer tools these days.
Yeah, I tend to prefer using, and Patrick may want to chime in here, I tend to prefer using the independent sites because they let me pick different locations and different browsers to test from. I'd rather not just run it from my local machine and say, all right, everything's great, and I live right next to where the server farm is,
Yeah, I agree. You can do some stuff in Chrome where you can actually throttle back your connection and have it act like a mobile connection or a crappy hotel connection, which, whenever I hear people talking about, well, everyone's on broadband these days, like clearly they've never stayed at a hotel in a while.
Right.
But there's a lot you can do in Chrome, but yeah, it's nice you can get it not only locally, but if you know that a client has international traffic, say, all right, throw it over in Germany and see what it looks like coming from Germany, and with that you can see a CDN shine quite a bit if you're doing things pretty well.
Yeah, and I remember I tweeted out about this. I was using the internet on a plane while I was traveling over the country, and if you want to have an idea of what your website is like on a lousy connection, load it from a plane. And yeah, really, it will give you an idea of what it is like in third world countries or remote, lousy connections, and it's very eye-opening.
You could, depending on how much I was just traveling up in Canada, and as soon as I crossed the border, I got a text message from my service provider saying it's going to cost you $2 for every megabyte you're downloading.
Right.
And it took me about $20 to get from the airport to where I was going, just to figure out the few details I needed at the key transition points.
And suddenly, putting that huge animated GIF on your website doesn't seem like such a great idea when you're getting charged that much per megabyte. Yeah. But let's move over to a test that I like a lot called GT metrics. And I'm generalizing, but this primarily is measuring server-side stuff. Most of the things that you see on here are things that can be fixed on the server side of things. And I think it'll be informative to just kind of go through here and see what it is pointing out to us. So it's telling us that the page took about 3.5 seconds to load, which jives with what web page test. They said it took a little bit longer. It's got the number of requests and the total size of all the data that was transmitted on the web page. And then there are a number of different tabs here. It's going to say page speed here. This is not the same as Google Page Speed Insights. I don't know why they call it page speed. I'm not really sure. But so the first item here is served scaled images, right? And for it orders these things by how important it thinks it is and how bad of a grade you're getting on it. And it will tell you the priority, high, low, etc. So serving scaled images. Basically, this is telling us that we are serving images that are larger than they're being displayed as. And it looks like you might be doing this from a Retina point of view. Is that what you're doing, or are they just scaled?
I don't know.
Okay.
Don't know.
It's almost double the size, but not quite.
Yeah, I would guess we're cutting them so they're the right size for Retina, but not adjusting them after that.
So and this is a really important thing, and if there's one thing that you optimize on your pages, it is that you scale your images to be the right size in terms of the container that they're displayed in. Because there's just no reason to load a really large image if you're displaying it small.
And I guess sometimes it's worth having an image that's really going to look good on Retina, and sometimes you might not even need an image that's that large. It really comes down to how you think people are going to be using that.
It depends what it is, and if you're using UI element type things, might be better off as a custom font or as an SVG, so then you just don't even have to worry about it. Mm-hmm. But this is a pretty easy problem to solve, especially with Craft. It has transforms built into it. Just create transforms that are going to generate the sizes that you need for the various breakpoints. If you've got, if you're using a framework, like you said you're using Foundation.
Yeah, I believe, yeah. Yeah, not Bootstrap.
Well, I mean, Bootstrap is on there. I don't know what you're loading, but it's in there somewhere.
I'm going to have to look into that, yeah.
But yeah, it's just the name of the domain. I'm wondering if that's, I don't know if it's actually Bootstrap or if that just happens to be one of the servers from XCDN.
It is font awesome.
There you go.
Okay, there we go.
And I'm going to chastise you about that in a minute, too.
But we have all the fonts, though, right?
Yeah. So go on. You've got every icon that you need now.
Need that Google Plus one.
Yeah. So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, weird. Some kind of noise just cut out. Oh, now it's back.
I wonder if it's the air conditioner on my end.
Doesn't matter. So basically, scale your images properly. Like if you've got a number of different breakpoints in your framework, maybe you've got a mobile, a mobile landscape, and then a desktop, and then large, or whatever they are. Create a transform for each media breakpoint so that the images are going to be served at the right size for that particular media breakpoint. And this is a pretty easy thing to fix, and it's also something that really will save a ton of bandwidth. I mean, look at this. We're talking about 814K, 72% that it will save if you just optimize this. And yeah, it may not seem like a big deal, but when you're crossing the border into Canada, this is going to be a big deal.
It's like $4 for a page right there.
Yeah. And also, I always try to think about these things from a mobile point of view and how expensive this is going to be on mobile. So we really do want to have our kind of images optimized for this stuff. And before I forget, I'll chastise you about your Font Awesome.
I'm ready.
So here's the thing about Font Awesome. So Font Awesome is kind of awesome, but what you get is you get a font with hundreds of glyphs in it, right? And it loads that entire font, and the last I saw, I think it was like 160K, something like that, the font is. And if on your site you're just using a couple of the icons, which it looks like...
Yeah, we might be using 4 or 6 throughout the site or something, but it's low.
Right. So what I would recommend you do for that is use something like Fontello. And there are others. There's Ico Moon is another one. And let me make this a little bit bigger so everybody can see. But basically, you just pick what icons you want. The ones with the little circles around it are the ones that I want. You can also upload your own stuff if you want. If you have an artist that drew an icon for you, you can just upload it. And when you say download this web font, it downloads a custom-built font with just the glyphs that you're using and the CSS that you need to display those. And as you can see, all of the Font Awesome icons are here. Mm-hmm. So instead of using the whole thing, you can just pick the couple of icons that you need and generate it.
It looks like this even supports a few other libraries of fonts.
Yes,
so.
It supports a number of libraries, so you can just pick whichever ones you want. If it doesn't have what you want, you can just upload the image, and it will make a custom font for you. And it's really nice because you'll go from 150K to something like 4K, for your icon fonts. And it does integrate with Gulp and Grunt, so you can generate this stuff manually. It has like a JSON config file. You just change it, and Gulp or Grunt will generate it for you. So, that's my quick rant on icon fonts. I hate it when I see Font Awesome just
inline,
and then I see 2 icons.
it's something that's so easy to just grab the URL and throw it in while you're working to have what you need or explore what you need, and then if you forget to take it out or optimize it later, you've run into this having just too much around situations.
Yeah, and all these little things add up, you know. But let's get back to what we were looking at before here. So, leverage browser caching. Basically, what this is saying is that all of these resources are not being cached on the client side for a long enough time. Because ideally, you know, someone visits your web page and static things that are unlikely to change, you want them to be cached locally so that they don't have to go across the wire to load them again. Typekit, there's nothing you can do about it except not use Typekit, which is what I recommend, and Patrick hates it when I say that.
Yeah, I feel the same anymore. Yes.
You can hack the Typekit default embed code a little bit to try to make it more async, because they have like pseudo async the way they give it to you. You can change it around and like do your own classes. Yeah,
the async for Typekit also requires you start creating CSS classes that like stop the font from flashing the wrong way and stuff. But it seems to just
get around a lot of that. You can use like Google Web Font Loader. I actually like ones that let you embed your own fonts. My Fonts actually lets you embed them locally. Hoffler & Co. lets you kind of embed them locally, but they still make you call a CSS file on their remote server before you then get to talk to your own local fonts. Web Fonts, it's just a whole DRM, kludgy DRM situation right now.
So what is the, you know, if you have the budget and you can do it, you buy the font, you put it on your server, you manage it with your CDN. That's probably the best approach.
Right. At least from my point of view, yes. And here's another article on performance that basically says the same thing. The thing about using Typekit is, and other, you know, I'm saying Typekit, but really I mean any of these kind of font APIs, is that they're very convenient, but they do add overhead from the point of view of they add to the number of HTTP requests that you have to do. And one of the other kind of semi-annoying things that I've seen happen with Typekit, and I'm seeing it on your page, is the actual fonts that are being loaded are base 64 encoded. So here are the fonts that you're loading. And base 64 is just a really inefficient way to encode this stuff. So I would much rather see these fonts, you know, buy the fonts, store them locally, have your CDN serve them up, provide multiple formats so that the browser can choose which format it wants. The WOFF2 format is a lot more efficient than the other formats that are out there, and I think most browsers are supporting it. But as you can see here,
is it Typekit that's base 64 encoding them?
Yes.
Or is that okay?
And you can see, I mean, you know as well as I do that if you base 64 encode binary data, it's just bigger. You know, it's a lot bigger. And we've got a lot of fonts on here. That's the other thing that I would probably do, is try to do a audit of your page to see, are you really using all of these fonts, and do we really need all of these? And the other thing about using external packages like this is, yes, they are useful, but right here we're seeing that there's a 10-minute expiration time for this script, which basically means that if someone goes to your web page and then they go get a cup of coffee and then they go to another page, it's going to reload that JavaScript. It's going to go out on the wire and download it again. It doesn't allow the client-side browser to cache this for any reasonable length of time. And there's a reason why they do this, right? Because if they make a mistake in Typekit and they need to fix something, they want that fix to be instantly available. Right? It's the same thing with Google Analytics. You can see here it's got a 2-hour expiration time. One of the thorns in my side and Patrick's side is that, you know, we've optimized the crap out of these websites, but Google PageSpeed Insights complains about Google Analytics, right? Which is, you cannot get a perfect score if you're using Google Analytics. So, you know, one of the things that I've been using is a plugin I wrote called Instant Analytics, which basically lets you do the same thing that the JavaScript does, but it does it server side, without having to have this kind of impact of the resources here. The other things that I'm seeing here, you've got a number of these things that are only being cached for a day. All of these things really, these are all under your control because they're all from your domain. These really all should be cached for like 30 days. And if you do need asset revisioning, I mean, you're already using the query string as kind of a version for all of these things.
A little small, so let's just say it out loud what we have there. So at the end of the, say, CSS or JS URL, we have a question mark equals some value, which we can change to cache bust that resource if we really needed to.
Right, and because you have that there, there's no reason to not let them cache this for as long as they possibly want to. Because when you make a change, you can just bump the query string to force the cache to be dumped. It's a whole nother discussion, so I won't get into it long, but I actually prefer file name-based cache busting as opposed to the query string, because some proxies will not properly handle the query string when they're caching stuff. Squid is one that by default doesn't do it, and I think if you're using some CDNs, you actually have to manually turn it on.
And file name cache busting is easier if you have the right build script involved to help you do that. It's a little more tricky if you don't, because you have to remember where you're
Nginx. Yeah, Nginx makes it easy, actually.
Yeah, but the real takeaway is that on your server, and a good place to look is the HTML5 boilerplate. They have server configs for both Apache and Nginx that will show you how to do all this stuff. But all of these static resources should have at least a 30-day expiration time, so that the client can just cache them. And if you need to break the cache, like if you change your print.css, then you just bump the version number and you force it.
Yes.
So there is that. And this is where it says to remove query strings from static resources. So this is just what we're talking about. That some proxy servers are not going to properly cache these things. So again, it's a case for using file name-based cache busting, and we won't get too into that. But yeah, you're going to need. You're not strictly going to need, but it definitely helps to have a workflow tool like Gulp or Grunt to kind of automate this stuff. Specify image dimensions. This one is super easy to fix. Basically, it's just saying that you have image tags on your page, and you're not specifying a height or a width for these images. And the reason why that matters is if you specify a height and a width for these images, the layout engine can lay everything out while it waits for these images to load, right? If you don't specify a height and a width, it has to load all of these images fully so it knows how big they are, and then it can lay things out, right? So it's definitely going to make sense for you to add the height and the width tag to these images.
How does this one reconcile with, previously we were looking at optimizing the images for different media queries.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have the image tag in the code. So
you can just do it via CSS, right? So at different CSS,
so you can even define the width and height via CSS.
Sure. Yeah. There's no reason why you can't just do that.
Obviously responsive kind of threw a wrench in things when suddenly everything became fluid. Do you do any sort of tricks with like a height, like a padding top to account for the height, or do you actually set a width and height straight on the image tag? Because I remember doing this quite a bit back when everything was desktop only.
In terms of what? I mean, I'm not sure what you're asking. Sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, the idea behind which you're on missing width or height attributes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That you used to set img width equals 400, height equals 300.
Right.
But with responsive, it's a little bit tough because at one viewport it's going to be 400, but then on a tablet it's going to be scaling proportionally. Are you still adding width and height tags and then overriding them with CSS? Because the big thing was that you want to make sure that your page could be laid out properly, and it wasn't bouncing all over the place and not knowing how big the images were until everything loaded, and then having to do repaints.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm typically doing these images with source sets, right? And specifying that stuff in there. I do still use height and width attributes for these things.
Okay.
If it is something that is going to be changing radically, at the various breakpoints, there are a couple little tricks, ways around that where you can just set that to be whatever it should be via JavaScript. You can be looking at the and it doesn't need to be just like that URL you gave me a while ago. You might not need jQuery. You don't need jQuery for any of this stuff.
Yep.
You can look at, is it a Retina display or not? What is the browser width? And then you can just directly set the height and the width of these things right in line, and it doesn't delay anything. So that's one way to kind of handle that. That's my dogs.
Have you touched on yet that everything on the homepage is a ping file right now?
I haven't.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to get too, but yeah, I was gonna say, scroll down. I think there's some screenshots on the homepage or somewhere. We're pulling in.
There we go.
Yes, these visuals. So right now, these are all done as ping files.
Yep.
And just to think about what's the really low-hanging fruit? Because some of the stuff you could spend a lot of time doing server configs and all that, but
yep.
If you change these to be image transforms and switch them over to JPEGs rather than pings, you're just going to see a massive downsizing in how large these images are. Right now, ping is a completely lossless format. A JPEG is a little bit lossy, but for something like this, just a tiny bit of artifacting isn't a big issue.
Yeah, for sure.
You can go from 300 kilobytes down to 20 kilobytes, so you can save a ton of megabytes, even possibly just by switching these from pings to JPEGs.
Yeah, and as when you're setting up your transforms to do the various responsive sizes, you can just have it force it to go to JPEG for these things, like Patrick's saying, and yeah, you'll save a ton of time in terms of how long it takes to load, and you'll also be saving your bandwidth and the bandwidth of the people that are crossing into Canada and trying to load your site.
Yeah, this too, is a way to, I mean, we do this on the control panel for clients a lot more as web developers, I think, optimizing how the clients are uploading images, and here we have a kind of a user-generated content area where we don't have the time to tell everybody how to optimize and upload the image in the right format, so that's a really handy idea there to use the transform that gets us what we need.
Yeah. Good point, Patrick. I knew there's a reason we had you here.
Thanks.
Okay, so whatever. I'm not even going to talk about this. Serve resources from a consistent URL. It's basically telling you that you're serving the same thing, from two different places.
Typekit.
One is p.typekit.net, the other is ping.typekit.net. Yet another curse you typekit. But this is probably also just something in your code where in one place you're referencing one domain and in another you're referencing another. So probably fix that, because this is an additional DNS lookup and it's also downloading the same thing twice, which there's no point in that. Inline small CSS, basically you've got a very tiny print.css, and it's basically saying that the overhead of creating a new connection, going out and downloading it, is not worth it for something that is this small, and instead it's saying just inline it. Just inline the CSS, because it's not so big. Cache validator, yep, that's what I thought. Again, this is something that just kind of ends up happening when you're using various APIs to load stuff. You no longer have control over how the cache for these various things are invalidated. It's up to whatever source that you're getting them from. And this is, again, why I personally prefer to serve all of the resources myself, so that I can control how they're cached, how they're validated. And if you're using one of these service APIs, I mean, it is what it is. You get what they give you. May not seem like a big deal, but that's why I've got OCD.
Can you also maybe speak? You say I think again we have more DNS lookups each time we're using these
Yep.
third-party resources. What's the cost of a DNS lookup?
That, like anything, it depends. It depends on your DNS servers and how performant they are. But it's one of those things that it definitely adds up when you're talking about, I would say like, 30 milliseconds, maybe more. It could be quite a bit more, depending on, how your DNS is, or if you're on a mobile device somewhere. Those adding a round trip whenever you're on a high latency connection is very costly.
So for each of those, we're calling out to the settings, looking at the name servers, saying where is this, and going to find it, and coming back.
Exactly. And there are people that really care about performance. They serve everything from as few domains as possible, and they also use a high performance DNS for their stuff. Optimize the order of the styles. Yeah, we'll get into this later when we look at the Google PageSpeed Insights. But this is I think really useful because a lot of people may have seen or heard of these tools, but then they see all of these things and they're like, I don't know what the hell these things mean. So I think it's useful that we're kind of going over these in detail. All right, so this is pointing out something that we already knew from here. Leverage browser caching and add expires headers are basically the same thing. And it should be the same resources we're seeing here as we're seeing here. Again, it's basically just saying let the local browser cache these things. And for a lot of these things, the stuff under our control, we can change these to be 30 days and bust them with the query string or file name-based cache busting. For external stuff, there's nothing we can do. I mean, it's under their control, and it is what it is. The only thing you can really do, if you really wanted to, is you can make a copy of it, and every 24 hours update your local copy or something if you really cared about it.
If you pay $100,000 a year for Analytics 360, they help you get 100 on there.
So it's saying use a content delivery network. And it's basically just complaining because it's not recognizing Typekit as a CDN. Whatever.
Yahoo will be gone in a year, so don't worry too much about why slow.
So here are the cookie-free domains, and this is kind of what we touched on earlier. Why we really want to be using a CDN, because we don't want cookies to be on every single one of these. And it may seem very picky or pedantic or whatever, but if you have a lot of resources on your page, it's completely unnecessary to have the cookies attached to every single one of them. And that's why you would want to be using.
Can you explain more about why are cookies attached to these, or where do the cookies get attached? What problem is that trying to solve that we're trying to undo?
Well, if you set a cookie on straightupcraft.com, like maybe you've got a logged in cookie or whatever, any resource that is served from straightupcraft.com is going to get those cookies attached to it. And really, we only care about it when it's attached to the HTML files, right? Because that's where we have our JavaScript code and other stuff that's looking at them. But the way that cookies work is they get attached to every single request that is coming from the domain that they're attached to. And as you can see, it's like completely useless to have the craft session or session cookies attached to Danson's thumb.png, right? Like there's just no reason for it.
So when we say CDN, we're putting that resource at another? Are you saying put that resource at another URL that's not the straight up craft domain that doesn't have cookies associated with it?
Exactly. And different people use different CDNs. I use Max CDN for most things, and I'll have a domain name like assets.straightupcraft.com or something like that. Or maybe something completely different like assets.straightupcraft.net or whatever, which is a completely different domain, so none of those cookies are going to be attached to any of those static resources.
Now, I believe it's worth noting that cookies, I believe this is true, I'm not an expert on it, but I believe cookies applied to a top-level domain get applied to all subdomains below it. So because we don't have www in our URL, the cookies associated with straightupcraft.com would also get applied to assets.straightupcraft or members.straightupcraft or whatever other subdomains we had with it.
I'll let Patrick answer that. It depends.
Yeah, we discussed it on Slack like a week or two ago. So this is, and like www feels so like antiquated and like adorable, but it does namespace your cookies into a subdomain, which is nice. And right, where you're running everything on straightupcraft.com rather than www.straightupcraft.com, yeah, those cookies that are assigned to the bare domain, they do get inherited down to any subdomain. So you could do like straightupcraftstatic.com, and then in your in your like environment variables set up a static base URL and then throw it into your assets. Like you could do it like that if you just wanted to not even use a CDN but just do it all within your local. You'd probably be best served using your own domain where you are using the bare domain.
Yeah, you can configure cookies so that they only apply to specific subdomains. But whatever. I mean, just to be safe, and you will get a URL from your CDN that you can just use as well. It doesn't have to be something that you own. For instance, like you'll get something like straightupcraft.maxcdn.com or whatever, and you can just use that for serving the assets. So make fewer HTTP requests. This is something that will matter much, much less if you're using HTTP2. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess that's it. And I believe because we use Cloudflare, we're using HTTP2, so this may or not matter. But I have yet to see any like performance tests or tried to do any myself to see what it means. But basically with HTTP2, if I understand it correctly, it makes more sense to have 20 CSS. If you have 20 CSS or JavaScript files, it makes more sense to leave them as 20 versus concatenate them all together, because the way the resources get loaded is side by side, and if you change any one of them, it would just break the cache for that one and reload it rather than break the cache for all of them. And
yeah, so I mean the old school way of doing things is you concatenate everything together, and then yeah, if you change anything, you break the whole thing. This is going to be still somewhat helpful, but less important with HTTP2 because it does support multiplexing, which is you can be downloading multiple resources at the same time. So it doesn't hurt you nearly as much to have a whole bunch of individual files. And it is, the whole reason for concatenating this stuff in the first place is really a way to adapt to shortcomings in the technology, which they're trying to overcome with HTTP2. So I'm not really going to worry too much about this one, but it is worth noting that when you do start using a whole bunch of services like Typekit or whatever, you will tend to get more of these things, right? Because you'll load a JavaScript and then it will in turn load a bunch of other things and yada yada yada. But it's less of a big deal, especially when you're going to be moving this to HTTP2. I just wouldn't lose a whole lot of sleep over it. What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, the way, to me, like, if something feels like a hack, it probably is a hack and will eventually be fixed. And, like, concatenating every single page's CSS and every single page's JavaScript has always felt weird.
Yeah.
And so, like, it always felt wrong. And, I like that HTTP2. I like, Andrew, you had the idea of, like, the feeding trough that used to be that everyone would gather and try to eat at the trough, or, in a, like, single bucket. And now it's like a trough where everything can hit you at the same time. It was on the Craft podcast where people were like, "What's he talking about?"
Well, I did that mostly to try and make make Michael laugh.
It was good, but I liked it. I had the beautiful visual of that trough. And yeah, I mean, and there's so much stuff coming down the line with like ECMA6 script where you can import just the modules you need from JavaScript and do it on the fly. That, to me, I think, I mean, you could go. It would be nice probably to concatenate your style sheets for now, and it doesn't look like you're doing a ton, but I think we'll probably get into the template soon.
Yeah.
We saw that big time to first byte. That's where you're gonna make probably 80% of your speed savings. Like this is the stuff that'll fix itself if you're doing HTTP 2.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I do love about HTTP 2 is that I'm already using require.js to manage dependencies and async load JavaScripts, and if you're doing that on HTTP 2, the impact is almost non-existent. But let's move along. Let's see if we got anything else nothing else too exciting here. It's saying what I mentioned to you before: reduce DNS lookups. There's just a ton of stuff that it's got to, before it can even get anything, it has to know where all this stuff is. And if you can consolidate this, great. These two you definitely can consolidate because they're both going to the same place, which is what it complained about before. And it's only grabbing 0.03K. What the heck is it grabbing? Probably your spec. Something. Actually, no. I think that Patrick, isn't that like your authorization number?
I think it's like I think it's a tracking pixel.
Yeah.
You may not be able to get around it.
Well, you can at least use only one domain because it's the same
font will be changing shortly on Straight Outta Craft.
Yeah, but I was going to say I don't think that's something in his code. I think that's something where you make a call to typekit and then it spurs on these other calls.
Well, why is it loading both? It's loading the same thing from two different domains.
Yeah, we'll get to the template and see. I don't know.
Okay. All right. So that is GT metrics, right? And you'll notice that some of what we found here, we also found here. We'll look at Pingdom, tools.pingdom.com, which is something that they actually recently overhauled their site to make it look a little bit nicer. It's giving us. I'm sorry, what?
More yellow.
More yellow, yeah. So it's telling us the top suggestions here. Minimize request size, and this is something that we looked at before. We've got all these fonts, and they're all base 64 encoded, so they're freaking huge, right? So I would recommend going in here and doing an audit of the fonts, make sure we really need all of these, and then try to serve them ideally locally in various formats, and if that's not possible, serve them via typekit, but not as base 64 encoded strings, and that will reduce their size. And you'd be amazed at how much this adds up on mobile. The fact that we've got to load all this crap, as well as the font awesome, the full thing.
Yeah,
it really
the other part too.
Difference.
I was gonna say that part too. It's less technical, but more just making the decisions. Like, jump back to that again. We're making what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 fonts are being used across maybe 1 or 2 typefaces. If you know that maybe you have heavy italic and you're like, I don't think we've ever used heavy italic on the site.
Right.
You may not need that. You may be able to cut down on the number of fonts, or if you're doing client work and you have a designer who's totally in love with demi-bold and he or she thinks that demi-bold is like so much more pure than bold, but then they also use bold, like tell them like, hey, and this gets into performance budgets and stuff that like Brad Frost has done, but say like, hey, we can't be loading demi-bold and bold. It's crazy.
Right.
And make them make a decision and be consistent.
Yeah, and I like the idea of performance budgets where you tell them, okay, we have this amount in a budget. You get to pick the 4 things that you really need.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed here because on one hand we do this stuff for our clients, and I often recommend what we're talking here. Right. On the other hand, this is our site, and clearly
you're always the toughest customer. Yeah.
I've got the worst website in the history of the universe. I mean, there's nothing to be embarrassed about.
Yeah. So then I do think there's this challenge. Most of these decisions were made because wanted to get something up quickly, only had the weekend and a few hours, just grabbed the typekit con, didn't even look at the what it did or didn't include because I was worried about trying to push something live. And now we're doubling back and seeing this. So I think some of this stuff is meant to happen down the road. As a lot of these services are helpful to get up and running quickly, but I think as we're seeing here, it's really important that, you know, if what you did is successful or worthwhile to your customers, doubling back on this is important, because I can tell you, we do get feedback on straight up craft performance, and people, you know, aren't happy all the time with all the pages on the site and how quickly they load.
So Ben, are you telling me that when you were working on this several years ago, you didn't know that you're going to be facing the Inquisition from me and Patrick?
Well, I love that we're recording this, because we can do this again in a year now and see if we've been able to improve all of these.
But no, I do understand what you're saying. One of the things that I have worked really hard on is making sure that my workflow is such that it's really hard for me to make a site that doesn't perform well. Because, and this is something that is as a result of pain that I have personally experienced, because I have built stuff that wasn't performant, and then the work that I had to do to go back and fix it was very painful. And so it's the kind of thing where I spent a ton of time trying to get my workflow set up so that when I start a new site, I would have to work so hard to make it not perform. And it's one of those things where when you want to get something up quickly, but after you've done it for a long time, you realize that I'm really going to pay for this at some point down the road. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think as an organization, we too are going through that process of how do we take this concept and not just know about it, but incorporate it into our build process, and actually have. And I think a lot of these tools you're sharing here, but train everybody on our team that you're going to be judged, your work is going to be judged if these things are coming out positive or negative. And we have a lot of great tools that if you as an individual developer or designer start judging your work by this, or even clients, if you start using these tools to judge the web firm you're working with, it provides a nice communication about, hey, who's worrying about this? This is what we consider to be a website.
And if you plan this up front, you know, if you have a workflow, and I know Patrick and I are doing similar things, when we set up a new site, like everything that we need to have that site be performant is already there. So it's a matter of where the work was done. You know, we spent a ton of time front-loading things, you know, getting the system in place so that we have a factory that is super efficient and that everything that comes out of that factory is going to be performant. Now, that is not the speediest way to do it, right? It would be a lot easier for us to just, you know, start working on a site. And I'm not sure where Patrick is coming from this, but from my point of view, it was born out of the pain of having to go back and fix all the stuff that I thought I was saving time with. You know
I think the biggest pain that I perceive is when you don't do it right the first time, you get asked to make a 15-minute update, and it takes 3 hours.
Oh, at least.
And it's hard to communicate around that.
And that happens, you know, dozens and dozens of times in the course of a project. But yeah, let's get back to this real quick. So leverage browser caching. Again, this is pointing out the same thing that GT Metrics was. We want to have a far future expiration date on all this stuff so that the browser can cache it. And again, this is where we were talking about using file name-based cache busting. It's complaining about the fact that we're using a query string for versioning these things. So that's all with that. We are going to move to PageSpeed Insights, which is something that I'm infamous for, and people hate my guts because someone will post a site in straight up Craft, in the Craft Slack, and I'll run PageSpeed Insights on it, and they'll be like, "What a dick!" You know, I was just announcing it.
I talked to someone there's someone on Craft Slack who works for a large company, like you have their products in your house type company, and he was saying that people on their team and executives, they have bookmarked PageSpeed Insights now because it's such a dead simple number, and you can point and say bad or good.
Yep.
And so it's a way that helps you sell. I'm sure, Andrew, you're about to walk through all that, but it's become part of my selling process at this point.
Yeah, and I've talked about it before, and basically I look at performance as a feature. When I am building a site, I'm not just building you something pretty. I'm not just building you something that does what you need it to do. Part of one of the main features of the sites that I build is that it performs really well. And there have been an infinite number of studies that speak to the number of conversions and bounce rates and how they're incredibly tied to your website performance. And I think you can just Google them, but there's some ridiculous numbers, like for every half a second Walmart saved, they made like an extra $100,000 or something ridiculous like that.
I believe there's even a perception of your brand is a higher quality. If your site performs 20% better than your closest competitors, people will perceive an improved quality in your brand.
And I use that as Patrick does as part of the selling process. Like I will run all of these tests on the client site before I do work on it, and then I can show them that Google says it's this much better now. And Google is a name that means something to people. Because a lot of these guys, you do the website work and they'll look at it and they'll say it looks pretty, but they really have no idea of what kind of quality job that you did. But if you document it like this, where you've got a before and after, that resonates really well with them. And then the other thing that I do also is I do comps with competitors in their industry. And I can say, look, this hardware site that we just redid for you, we're getting a 97 on Google PageSpeed Insights. Bob's Hardware down the street, that's your main competitor, he's at 45. And people love that. It gives them a basis and a way to compare things. But I really do think that performance is a feature. And, even if you're the only game in town, like let's say that Straight Up Craft is the only source for something. Let's say the plugin listing, for instance, right? People will put up with it if it's slow, but they won't like it.
Well, they actually didn't. We had somebody create a separate plugin list based on the JSON feed of ours at one point because it was running so slow. And we were in the process of adding a solution at the time that happened. But I thought it was interesting that data these days, if you're providing it in the right formats, people can take your data and do whatever they want with it and almost create a competitor from scratch.
Yeah, and obviously, if you have direct competitors, it's substantively going to benefit you if your site is faster, right? Your bounce rate will be lower, your conversions will be higher, and satisfaction will be better. But even if you don't have a direct competitor, let's say you're the only source for something. The analogy I make is, you go to your bank, right? And nobody likes to have to wait in line. You go to your bank and you get a line of like 20 people and you've got one check to deposit and you want to kill yourself, And it's the only game in town because it's your only local branch location. So you're still going to go there. It's not like you're not going to go, but you're going to be unhappy about it. And we want people to be happy about the brands that we're building sites for, And again, nobody likes waiting, and especially on mobile. Nobody likes waiting.
Which brings us to the next red metric.
Yes. Yes. So Google PageSpeed Insights is different than the other tests that we looked at. Most of the other tests we looked at were primarily server-side things, how various things are optimized in terms of how they're cached, and et cetera, et cetera. PageSpeed Insights really is evaluating how well does this thing render in the user's browser, whether that's mobile or desktop, and we see a nice little preview of them here. Whenever you're looking at a test, it's important to know what it tests, right? So primarily what this is testing is in-browser rendering speed. And the interesting thing about Google PageSpeed Insights is it's kind of like an infinitely deep well, in that we can see that it's listing a few things here. Once we fix these things and rerun the test, it's going to show more things, right? Well, it's just the way it works. And you're going to basically fix the major things and then rerun it and see what else it says. So why don't we take a look at, and a lot of people run this test, right? And they see, oh, it's a 53. Okay, I don't know what the hell that means, or it's telling me all of these things that I should fix, but I don't really know what any of these things are. So I think it makes sense to kind of talk about them. And actually, Patrick, why don't I let you go on the number one thing that it says here to fix, which is the render blocking CSS and JavaScript, because I need a drink. My mouth is getting dry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, this is kind of a pet peeve. We've already talked about typekit a little bit. I'm assuming everyone knows what render blocking JavaScript is, but basically...
No, tell them.
Nothing. Let's be explicit, yeah.
Assume nothing! Yeah, basically, JavaScript, if it's not asynchronous or not deferred, it needs to run and will basically halt everything from happening while that is going on. And even though typekit has this little setting in their embed, and you may be using it where it says async equals true, the script call itself is not actually asynchronous. Everything after that point is asynchronous, but the actual script call is still not asynchronous. So that's why I call it pseudo-async. There is a little bit of code that I found after being frustrated with this for a while, and I'm trying to remember if I'm even using typekit anymore on my site, where you can make it more async than it is. Let's see. I'm just trying to
is that like being less pregnant? Well, let me take a step back now that I've had a sip of water and just kind of explain to people something even a little more general. So what it's complaining about is this above the fold content, right? And above the fold comes from newspapers. When you had a newspaper, the stuff that was above the fold was, the headline story and the headline image, right? So in a web context, what is above the fold is what you see on your device without scrolling. When the page is first loaded, that is the above the fold content. So you can see on this device that we have here, this Android phone, this is the above the fold content. On a desktop, this is the above the fold content. So what Google wants to have happen is they want to be able to render all of the above the fold content without waiting for any external requests. No CSS, no JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera. And what this is saying is that Google is saying, I cannot render this above the fold content because this script is blocking it, and all of these CSS resources have to be loaded before I can even render this. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, and for typekit specifically, I'll throw it into the chat. I don't know if there's a better way to share it, but there's a little trick that I use that will let you basically do a lot of what typekit does normally, where it does a web font loading class on your HTML element, and then at time of typekit load, it swaps it over to WF active, so that you know that, hey, our web fonts are now active. If you want to fade them from 0 opacity into 1 to avoid the flash font style text, you can do that. But basically, it lets you truly be async with the way that typekit runs. So that's one thing I've done. I found it somewhere, maybe on Stack Overflow, where someone else was struggling with the same thing, and it's been a help.
So you managed to become less pregnant.
I guess.
Yeah, I'm just giving Patrick some grief. So my stance on it is just, if you can possibly help it, just don't use typekit. If you need to.
It is possible to get a perfect 100 out of 100 score and still use typekit with my code.
That's true.
I got from someone else.
And for the context here too, TypeScript's not the only offender right now.
Yes, right. We're using typekit generally, but it's any external kind of service like this. And Patrick's 100% correct that there are ways that you can kind of hammer it into shape and to get it to do what you want. All I'm saying is that if you have an alternative, maybe consider taking it. If you don't, if there are certain fonts that you really need and a designer really needs this font, then whatever, do what you got to do to make it happen. But the real point here is we want to be able to render this above the fold content instantly. It's all about perception of performance, right? So all that really matters from a user's perspective is that when they load this page, they instantly see something and they can instantly interact with it. And by having it so that we don't need to load all of this stuff in order to render this, we're giving them the perception of enormous speed because they can instantly see what is there. And the basic methodology is that we use something called critical CSS, which is part of the AMP spec. If you care about Google's AMP spec, where essentially
AMP is accelerated mobile pages.
Correct. Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that. And really what it is a collection of methodologies for building web pages with a little bit of custom JavaScript mixed in. But the real idea behind AMP is something that I've been building web pages this way for quite some time before AMP existed. It's really to give a name for what Google wants you to do, which is to have just the CSS that we need to render this above the fold content and have that inlined in our HTML code, right? And the idea is, and there are a number of ways that you can accomplish this. The easiest way is to be using a workflow tool like Gulp or Grunt, and there's a critical module for both of them that essentially what it does is it renders your web page in a headless browser, and then it scrapes it for whatever CSS is on the above the fold content, and then returns that to you. So the basic idea is that we inline just the CSS that's needed to render this above the fold content, and then everything else, like the rest of the site CSS, we load that async later on. And it happens quick enough that by the time the user is actually interacting with the page, it's already going to be loaded, and it gets cached later on too, which is pretty great. But the real thing that they want is instant accessibility. And if any of you guys have ever done iPhone or iPad development, I mean, they kind of did the same thing. In that when you developed an app, they would have a placard picture that when you launched the app, it would display that image while the rest of the app was loading to give the appearance of, hey, this thing is there, which is better than just a blank page while the thing is loading. And, this is something that you're going to see on a lot of web pages that are kind of done the traditional way. You will see Google complaining about this on every single one of them because you need to be doing the critical CSS, and you also need to be loading your JavaScript async. And the key is not blocking. We need to be able to load this stuff without waiting for anything else. Does that make sense, Ben?
I was going to ask, so these build scripts are helpful for this process, no doubt. For the average designer or developer who may not be familiar with the build script, do they need to learn one, or how would you approach that problem if you weren't comfortable with setting up your build script?
I would either hire someone to set one up for me, or I would sit down and do the work that you need to do to learn it, unfortunately.
Okay. I agree with that answer. I feel though we're kind of in this transition in web development right now where the design skill set is becoming more programmatic for certain things like this, and I've met several people who are great designers but uncomfortable with the steps needed to implement some of these things. So I feel
and I see people designing fantastic web pages that I would never be able to design, but the performance is terrible, and what that really begs for is a web developer on your team. There's no reason why a web designer has to do everything. You can, if you're a one-person shop, obviously that's different. You've got to learn all that yourself.
A lot of the time, it's one-person shops that are, good at good at a primary skill set, and then you've got to decide where you're outsourcing, where you're just taking performance hits.
Yeah, and I do sympathize because it is a decent amount to learn, and the only thing I can tell you is that the payoff is there. The payoff is there from the point of view of the payoff is not just that we can get a great performance score, right?
It's the value you're delivering to potential conversions and client experience and
it's that
designed experience. So.
Yeah, absolutely, it's that. But it's also that if you learn some of these automation tools like Gulp or Grunt, or I know Patrick is a CodeKit guy.
No.
Typekit, CodeKit.
I'm just teasing him. No, but if you take the time to learn these things, they will save you time. Yes, there is a high cost of initial investment, but you could almost liken it to upgrading your factory to have a robotic assembly line, as opposed to people manually putting stuff together. It will save you a ton of time. Once you get these things up to speed and you have learned them and you're doing stuff with them, and it will also let you do stuff that really feasibly you can't do any other way. Trying to manually do this critical CSS stuff would be really difficult. And who knows? Maybe some tool will come along someday and help try to automate this. But and I mean automate it from the point of view that you won't have to learn anything, right? You can just click a button and it will do it. But really, we live in the here and now, and I can't tell you. There have been a number of jobs that I've been hired in to work on specifically because I can do this kind of stuff. And I think that is going to be more and more important in the future as web development is more and more a commodity. The high-paying jobs or the jobs that big clients are really interested in, you're going to need this in your skill set to produce a performance site. And really, workflow tools like Gulp or Grunt, I think, are going to be a critical part of that.
Essentially, as soon as one of your competitors is stepping ahead in doing it, all the other people in the list are going to have incentive to be able to match their performance.
And I get it that with agencies there are relationships that last for years, and you may keep a client regardless of that. But I do think that at some point, if you're not building stuff that is competitive in this day and age, whatever the tech du jour is, because it's constantly going to be changing, you may be leaving some money on the table. And I'd be curious to hear what Patrick thinks about build tools and their importance in modern web development.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something where you're going to spend hours and hours, I know I did, trying to get a process up and running that you can then just put into every new project from that point on. But it means they're going to be doing things the right way. You're not going to ever feel like, oh, I'm doing this in a hackish way, and I know I should be doing it with an image sprite, but it's going to take me forever, and what am I going to manually make an image sprite? If you can do all that with a build tool, you just know going into every project you're doing things the right way. And absolutely, it becomes a selling point. It becomes a point of differentiation. If you have a higher hourly rate, and they're like, "Why are you so expensive? That other guy's, $80 an hour or something." You can say, "Well, I do these 5 different things, that they don't do."
Right.
And you can point to a page speed insights score. You can just show them how quickly your sites load, and how easily you're able to do things.
For instance, Patrick is going to be working with a client.
Yep.
Patrick can show them this.
Well done, Patrick.
I can do this for you.
Maybe one of the first websites on the internet that has it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
You're not using Google Analytics.
Text only, unless there's like text-only websites. Andrew followed shortly thereafter.
Oh, whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't want to hear it. Go ahead, tell the truth. What allowed you to get 100 out of 100?
I'd be able to take Google Analytics out of the mix due to instant analytics.
But yeah,
still some bots getting through. We'll talk about that at some point.
Yep. And so, and it's the same thing with me. I can go to people and say, look, a lot of people are familiar with Plugin Factory or whatever. This is one of a number of sites that I've made. I can go to people and say, look, I can do this for you. And then you show them their competitor, and whatever their score happens to be. And there is some credence given from clients when they look at it, and Google says this is good. I mean, that's the message that is being sent here, right? Google, this huge company that everyone bows to, says the work that you're doing is awesome, right? And I think that is meaningful. But kind of getting back to the build tool stuff. I mean, the reason why people are using these, and it's funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same. The build tools really remind me of the old Unix-style build scripts, like makefiles, right? Where it's just automating the building of stuff. And the number of things that you can automate, if you are more of a designer than a developer, once you spend the time to actually get a good build workflow going, you'll have more time to work on the actual design of your site, because the technical part of it will be done and out of the way. And from that point of view, I think build tools are supremely useful, and I can't imagine that they are going to be a less part of the industry anytime soon. If anything, it may be a requirement at some point soon that you need to be familiar with Grunt or Gulp to get certain jobs as a web developer. Not as a designer, but as a developer. Certainly, I could definitely see that. Like if Patrick is working on something and he needs help with it and he's looking to hire someone, he probably would want to get someone on there with experience using the workflow tools that he's using.
Yeah, it's very valuable these days with the increase.
Let's stop our tangent and just let's accept as fact that build tools, at least now, are very useful, right? So to fix the render blocking JavaScript, you're going to need to set up a front-end workflow with Gulp or Grunt that will generate critical CSS, and you can do that on a per template basis, right? It doesn't have to be different for every page. You may have 1,000 plugin pages, but the CSS that styles all of those is going to be the same, right? So we only need to generate one critical CSS per template, and we inline that in Twig by just using the source command, which is kind of like include, but it doesn't parse it. It just dumps it right in there. So.
And are you removing that critical CSS from all the CSS files, or do you just let it load twice there?
If you mean from the larger CSS that
yeah,
loads
you
later?
have a 10,000 line CSS file, you pull your critical CSS, which is hundreds of lines.
So Patrick and I do slightly different things, but I just inline the critical CSS, which ends up being anywhere from 4K to 16K uncompressed, which is not much when you look at modern websites. And it also is a very small render tree for the browser to compose and then render that critical CSS. So I just leave it there. And yes, it does overlap the maybe 150K of full site CSS that you have. But once that's loaded and cached, I mean, it just really doesn't matter. It becomes insignificant, and from my point of view, it's just a simplicity in design type of thing. So anyway, that's critical CSS. The other half of the equation is the render blocking JavaScript. You're going to need to load all of your JavaScript async. Currently I prefer require.js for this because it handles not just loading the JavaScript's async, but it also does dependency management. So let's say that you have some custom JavaScript you wrote for your site, and it needs jQuery, right? You can just, in the require.js config file, you just say dependency jQuery, right? And then in your actual Twig code or your actual HTML page, you just say require and then whatever the name of your custom script is, and it already knows what other JavaScripts that this thing depends on, and it will load them for you, right? So it's a dependency management thing too. It will take care of making sure everything that you need is loaded and is loaded in the right order for you. And there are a number of tools out there to do it. One of the things that I'm going to be looking into really soon is using something called Rollout and seeing what that does. Whatever. All that I really care about is that you're doing it, that you're loading your JavaScripts async, and that you have some kind of dependency management, whichever flavor du jour that you think is best. That's great. Whatever it is that you want to use is fine. So, do you have anything to add to that, Patrick? Or
no, I think that was great.
So let's look at reduced server response time. We already know that it's slow, right? So when it's saying that our server responded in 1.7 seconds, that's again our time to first byte coming back to kind of bite us and saying, hey, move this thing to PHP 7 and a better VPS, you know? Leverage browser cache. Go ahead.
Are we going to take a look at Twig at all on this today? Or because I'm wondering if there's, some of it might be that, and Brett, Ben, do you mind saying like who you're hosting with right now? Or if not, that's fine. Like,
We're hosting on Liquid Web on a private VPS. We manage our own servers, but this is actually one of the few sites we still have on a pretty old server right now, and we've been slowly migrating things to new infrastructure, but our own sites are later on the list than
yep, it happens.
Plumber's plumbing.
Yep.
But yeah, Patrick, yeah, we can look at, if Ben is willing, we can look at some of the templates after I'm done just kind of going through this, and I think we're almost done with this actually anyway. So here is leverage browser caching. Again, this is the same thing that the other reports told us. These static resources are not being allowed to be cached in the local browser cache. And again, it's just a server-side config that the HTML5 boilerplate server configs will give you some really, really good starting points. In fact, on one of my VPSs, I just include their file, and it just works kind of right out of the box. And optimize images. And again, after we fix some of these things, it may come back with more, but they become more and more kind of picky, you know? So here it's telling us that this image can be losslessly compressed. Patrick already pointed out that a decent number of the images on the website probably should be JPEGs, which will save us a great deal already. One of the other nice benefits of using a workflow tool like Gulp or Grunt is you can use ImageMin, which will losslessly recompress, no loss in quality at all, your PNGs and your JPEGs, just to strip out a bunch of junk that they don't need. They're going to display exactly the same. It's not recompressing them. It's just getting rid of a bunch of metadata and non-optimized things that are not needed in there. And
if you ever look at image files, sometimes they have like comments and stuff from the things that generated them, and it's interesting because you don't think of an image as a bunch of metadata that isn't being displayed to you, but if you ever look at the raw stuff behind the scenes, there is a lot of junk there.
Yep, and as part of my
SVGs, if you're generating SVGs with Illustrator or anything, there's a ton of extra crap that Illustrator throws in there that you can just you can generate it and go in there and delete half of it almost sometimes, and it still just works the same way as far as your users are.
Yep, and ImageMin is a kind of a meta tool in that it runs like PNG Crush and JPEG Optim, and it also will optimize SVGs to remove a lot of that cruft that you mentioned that we don't really need. And so I make that as part of my workflow script where it goes through and it optimizes all of these images that I create. So an interesting conundrum is, well, okay, then what do we do about client uploaded images, and how do we handle that? Because they can pick arbitrary images or whatever. So one of the tenets that I use for my site is that I do not allow I never display the image that the client uploads, right? What I display is that image transformed in some reasonable way. So just like we talked about before, it having different media breakpoints or whatever, in no place on my sites am I just taking the raw image that a client can upload. I'm at least converting it to some sane size, because who knows? I mean, they may upload like a 10 gigabyte image, right? And they're not going to know any better, and it's what their artist gave them. But let's at least transform it to be somewhat reasonable, and make the different sizes for different media breakpoints. And then what I've done for some sites is via cron. I run ImageMin on the user uploaded images to optimize them. Another way that it can be done is if you use that wonderful Imager plugin, which actually integrates with some of these image compression tools. And if you use that to generate your transforms, those can be optimized. So those are kind of two different ways to handle client uploaded images. I'm wondering, Patrick, do you have any other strategies for managing those?
Yeah, I mean, once in a while when I've really gone rogue, I actually run ImageMin on my uploads folder and just let it just, yeah.
Well, that's what I do on a cron job. Every 24 hours,
yeah,
I do
it just always scares me. Like, I feel like someday it's going to come across a funky JPEG or a funky PNG file and corrupt the file, and the client will be angry. So it scares me. I don't know. I mean, I think the biggest thing you can do is just have transforms in place, use reasonable JPEG qualities. Try to force JPEG if you know that it's not like a logo will probably be smaller to PNG file than it will in JPEG. But if it's anything,
in my experience, ImageMin, if it comes across a corrupted image, it just stops.
Yeah, I still get afraid that something bad's going to happen.
Yeah, potentially. And again, you can use Imager too to generate these kind of optimized things. So, yeah, I mean that's about it. So we've looked at web page test and the kind of data that it's telling us about the website and what is on here. We decided that time to first byte was a huge problem, and updating your VPS would be a really good idea. And GT Metrics told us a bunch of small server-side tweaks that can be done to make it more performant. And PageSpeed Insights told us that we got a lot of work to do because we have to retool our workflow in order to really make this page kind of performant. But I would love it if Ben was willing to screen share and put up maybe the front page template or something like that, so that Patrick could go to town on it.
Yeah, so let me see what we got here. I'm tentative to share the code just because it's a fairly abstract. If we're just sharing
nothing proprietary.
Some parts of this template code base are pretty abstract and hard to communicate quickly. So I don't think it's the best. As much as the goal on my list to make Straight Up Cat more of an educational site to the code itself, I'm a little tentative on that right now.
Whatever you feel comfortable with, or you can even, just talk about it in generalities too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, is caching being used. If you've done any work since 2.6, is eager loading in place, things like that.
Yeah, no, and I can confirm that no, at least the home page, we're not caching. We are caching on some pages.
Well, Ben, let's
eager
pretend.
loading, we haven't gone through and done that yet either. We are using. Go on.
I was going to say, before we get to this, let's pretend and say that you are a agency that hired myself and Patrick to come in and to take a look at the performance characteristics of your site, and have we provided stuff that is useful to you in terms of you now have a plan of attack for what you're going to do to optimize this.
Yeah, no, I think this gives us a really good picture of a lot of the things that we're experiencing on the site and first steps to start addressing those. I do think the next part here that we're talking about is an important one too, of going through the code and considering eager loading. We've been in some of our sections, like the plugins section, we updated that to use Joel Bradbury's Search Plus plugin, which is helpful performance there. And we're working on doing that for the Search Plus doesn't yet support all element types, but when it adds support for users, we'll be doing that to the professional section as well. So there's a lot of optimization opportunities there, and I'll admit those pages were created when I first created those pages, I didn't even add pagination. Like, we had a few people in the professional section. I was trying to get it up, and I put it up, and then at a certain point the plugin page all of a sudden we had 300 plugins. I still hadn't added pagination properly or any optimization to the page, and the page was crashing. And I had wrapped a cache tag around the page, and then the page was crashing. And then I learned if I took the cache tag off the page wouldn't crash. Because the additional overhead of the cache tag was crashing the page. And so for a week or two there, the page took like 10 seconds to load, or it was something absurd. And this is when Fred Fred had actually taken the JSON and just plugged it into what's Search Plus using? The Algolia API on his own to create like a little separate search.
Well, I don't think there's any reason to feel bad about this. Every single one of us has built a project that organically grew into something bigger than we ever thought it would be. Right, and when you don't architect something from the beginning to be this big thing that it's going to end up being, of course there are going to be problems with it. So I mean, whatever. I wouldn't feel bad about that at all.
Yeah, I'm going to hold off on sharing the template code today, folks. Not because I won't do it ever, but just I'm not. I think it's a lot to wrap our heads around, and I don't want to get into just trying to explain the structure of stuff versus focusing on.
So what we're going to do, if we were approaching this to optimize it, we are going to move it to a new VPS that runs PHP 7, Nginx 1.95 or later, so we can run HTTP2 on it. Get Let's Encrypt on there, so we've got a free, SSL certificate. The latest MariaDB, so we've got a nice performant backend. That's going to instantly cut off, probably 1.5 seconds from the time to first byte. So it's going to instantly feel more responsive. Then probably the next thing that I would do is just attack some of these low-hanging fruit in terms of the browser cache settings, in terms of the query strings, the image sizing, convert those images to JPEGs, make sure that we're using the right responsive sizes for the images, ditch Font Awesome entirely, use a custom Fontello font, make a few of these other tweaks, and then kind of a longer term thing that is an infrastructure thing that will benefit you in the long run is getting a nice gulp or grunt front-end workflow up and running. And that's actually the way that a lot of developers that I know have done this, is that they choose their own site as their guinea pig to build their optimized workflow. And they get it all working on their own page, and then they can replicate that to other clients to build client pages. So you really, you'll see the benefit for your own site, which, again, plumber's plumbing, maybe you don't care a whole lot about it. But then you get the added benefit of being able to have this workflow ready to go for your clients' pages, where it really can make a difference in terms of their happiness with the project, and in terms of how quickly you're able to get some of these things turned around. That would be my kind of summary of the strategy that I would approach, optimizing straight up craft.
Yeah, we definitely are in the process of doing some of this stuff. So maybe in 6 months or something, we can do a short test. We'll see if we get to make it to 100, a score of 100, or maybe just in that direction. But we could probably find the time to do a retrospective on this one down the road.
That'd be cool. That'd be cool.
So great, and yeah, it might be also fun to do a couple hangouts in the future on more specific topics that we covered here, like like the critical CSS and render blocking stuff. I could see us spending an hour on that alone, just talking about or looking more at the code on those techniques. And so.
Yeah, the other part too that we didn't get into, I'm just kind of digging into your style sheets in the back end, but things like if you do use a tool like Foundation, do you need every single component that comes with Foundation, or can you use their SaaS package to pick just the things you need? If you're not using their pricing tables, for example, right now you're pulling that in. There's a whole lot that a package like that pulls in. Yeah, there's nothing wrong if you do want to use Foundation, but just pare it down so you're not pulling in more code than is required.
Yeah, you can just turn off the imports for whatever you're not using.
I always recommend to young developers or designers getting into coding more. Like, one of the best things you can do for your skill set is learn what you can delete. And I feel like the best people, the best developers you'll meet, they don't hesitate when they're deleting code from a repository or a project. They know what should be there and what shouldn't be there, and they know if it's in use or not in use. And it's generally people who, I'll include myself in that, when you're learning new things, and you don't know exactly what you're doing, you kind of include the whole kitchen sink in trying to make sure you're not forgetting anything. But in the end, you're kind of building these barriers around yourself that lead to all these other issues.
Totally. Yeah.
You can see yourself. Sorry, we got a young programmer. He wanted to listen to your words of wisdom.
Excellent, excellent. If you hear any background noise, my sister and nephew showed up recently.
This is the young coder that you're talking about that needs to learn how to delete stuff.
All right.
You're already pretty good at destroying stuff, right, Ty?
Yeah, it's like when you take all of your toys out of the box and you just leave them on the floor instead of putting them back in the box.
No, you're absolutely right, though, about deleting stuff. I mean, I will admit I still hold my breath, but I am pretty quick to hit the delete key.
And it's hard if you inherit a large site with a lot of different things going on. You kind of have to get comfortable with searching the whole code base for what symbolizes what's in there. So CSS is a hard one to clean up sometimes because it can be in so many places in a project. Hello.
What'd you say? Say it here, Jack. Go ahead.
Did you put him on mute or something?
No, nobody's on mute. They can hear everything you're saying.
All right.
But yeah, I mean, Ben, hopefully that was all helpful. I realize that a decent amount of it was stuff that you're already aware of, and again, don't feel ashamed about any of it. All of us have built sites that we've looked at it later and gone, oh man.
Well, and regardless. Even when you build a site you're proud of, 2 years later, you feel the same way that you did anyway.
Well, and I honestly strongly feel that with any code base, whether it's a website or anything else, there comes a point where you just tear it down and you redo it because the cost of trying to fix it is going to be a little bit too high. And you're not going to end up with something that is going to be as good as if you start clean and just level it, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm glad we could do this, and I hope the fact that we could use straight up craft for it is a little bit relevant to folks in the community who might have used the site or experienced some of the performance challenges with it, and hope we see a lot of faster craft sites out there because of it. There's a lot of great stuff here that can be incorporated into all of our workflows. All right, any final comments before we wrap up?
Oh, it's been fun.
Great. All right, well then, next week we'll be talking about customizing the control panel in Craft CMS. This event will be posted on the Straight Up Craft website within a few hours. And this is a Straight Up Hangout weekly event presented by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. Thanks for coming out. We'll see you next time.